Hello and welcome back to Earthbeat Visions, a history of the future sound of London. Today we'll be wrapping up the ISDN era, starting with Far Out Son of Lung and the Ramblings of a Madman. Release date 15th May 1995. 1995 began for F.S.O.L in a very similar way to 94, with 4 months of silence. With releases and transmissions coming out every month from May to December of 94, the first 4 months of 95 were unusually quiet. It wasn't until May that the first new music emerged in the form of a full commercial release of the Far Out Son of Lung single. The track had been put out as a rare 12-inch the previous autumn. Now it was time for it to appear as a fully fledged single. The main purpose behind the release was to promote the forthcoming unlimited reissue of ISDN a couple of weeks later. Instead of offering a multi-part suite like previous singles Cascade and Lifeforms, however, the band opted for a more standard 4-track maxi single with B-sides representing different pieces from the live broadcasts. Part of the thinking behind this was that presenting newly reconstructed studio versions of tracks wouldn't fit the live album theme that the promotional campaign was using. One of the B-sides, Smokin' Japanese Babe, had been released twice previously, first as a B-side to the aforementioned white 12-inch and secondly on ISDN itself, albeit with different intro and outro environments. Both the new tracks would find their way onto the ISDN reissue, making the single seem somewhat redundant. That said, the first half of this version of Snake Hips is exclusive to the single, lending it a certain value, and of course the different environments make it an intriguing listen for fans. The front cover sees the debut of local restaurateur Vit, a man who'd unwillingly lent his name to a track the previous year. The story accompanying the album on the old EBV website always amused me. We wanted this man in Yage the movie. We snapped some photos, Pin mapped a texture from Goa recoloured onto the shots, it became the front cover. Vit hassled us for weeks for posters. I put up in restaurant. Finally we gave one to him. His face, unmoved, unflustered, finally he spoke. I not put up in restaurant. To be honest, I don't blame him. An excellent, trippy image suitable of the psychedelic sounding music on the release, it was also certainly very disturbing for Vit to see. His face peeling away, a red metallic texture, standing in front of a CG landscape. It's possibly not what the Thai cafe owner was used to. The rear cover features a more conventional shot of Vit walking along a street, as well as a recoloured picture of a dead dolphin on the back of a bike. The image was considered apt. Pin commented that it symbolised the death of Ambient, although this interpretation is open to a fair amount of scrutiny, even in the story it comes from. A track, Dead Dolphin, remains unreleased. The art is notable for another reason. The EBV logo, now separate from the 1970s Virgin symbol on the rear sleeve, it bears the legend Electronic Brain Violence for the first time. 2 years prior, EBV had been an initialism of Earthbeat Visions. By 1995, the band's imagery and ideas were considerably darker, and this new, more aggressive name was applied. As with all ISDN-era releases, there are no artwork credits. The run-out grooves on the 12-inch contain the following remarkable messages. Stand by for Boombox and I can smell your cock from here. Charming. The credits give the recording date of the tracks as 1995, which is at odds with the 1994 date given on ISDN. For the music video, the band continued their ultra-media approach and went somewhat overboard, creating a video for every track on the EP, created entirely in-house and released as a VHS. Far Out Son of Lung and the Ramblings of a Madman was the one single my local independent record shop couldn't seem to get in. It stayed on backorder for quite a few weeks, but never arrived. Very early on in my internet experience, I received a £5 Amazon voucher for something or other, maybe just joining them, and backordered the single on there. It never arrived. It wasn't until late 2000 that I managed to find a second-hand copy online for about £8 and finally got to hear Snake Hips Part 1, the last 90s FSOL Virgin track I ever got around to hearing. This, combined with the general lack of original material, makes the single one of my least listened to FSOL records. Despite the comparatively uncommercial lead track, even by FSOL standards, and the less expansive set of B-sides, the single still managed to reach number 22 in the UK charts, spending 3 weeks in the top 100 as what must be one of the strangest tracks ever to sneak into the top 40. The US release was more limited, with simply an imported UK 12-inch with an Astroworks sticker added to the rear released. Snake Hips Parts 1 and 2. The single version of Snake Hips is the Far Out Son of Lung release's only real exclusive track, with Part 1 being unreleased elsewhere. Very much in keeping with a lot of the ISDN era material, watery percussion samples, guitar loops, flute notes and drum breaks lead the piece. The vibrato added to the flute in places gives it a disconcerting feeling, and the track is chock full of sound, suitable for the drowning imagery given to it on the Far Out Son of Lung video. As the track builds, guitar becomes the dominant instrument, with layers of funky wah-wah samples lending a somewhat sleazy vibe. Part 1 segues into Part 2 seamlessly at around the 4-minute mark. Part 2 is effectively the same as the album version with a slightly different ending. Instead of a crescendo with the synth chords, the track simply cuts out, leaving the chords to play once before a piece ends. A remixed version of it was released as Far Out Son of Lung's Cow. The other tracks remain faithful to their album versions except the environments. The gated vocal sample and electric guitar chords found at the start of the album version of Amoeba actually form the opening environment of Smoking Japanese Babe, with additional trumpet replacing that track's synth outro. This version of Amoeba ends with reversed bells and bass guitar. Far Out Son of Lung and the Ramblings of a Madman VHS. After the success of 1994's Lifeforms video, the band went a step further, creating a 24-minute VHS including videos for all 5 tracks on the Far Out Son of Lung single. The video was created entirely in-house without any record company interference. The press release states the video utilises an assortment of local characters, and that EPV, F.S.O.L's Ultramedia company, processed, edited and modelled the entire video using an Apple Mac computer. Local flavour was provided by a Dollis Hill Thai restaurant owner called Vit. Famously, or perhaps infamously, Vit was thrown into a swimming pool for an underwater sequence. His claim to be able to swim was quickly turned about, faced with the pool itself. "I not do this, I cannot swim." The band had already paid £200 for what they wryly referred to as the incredible non-swimming dog, and not wanting to spend more of the day wasting time and money, Vit was pushed in with weights attached to him. Astonishingly, he continued to appear in the band's visuals after this event. This incident, of course, would go on to provide the title for the Dead Cities track Vit Drowning. The video for Far Out Son of Lung starts with time-lapse footage of London buildings before the computer imagery comes in. Instead of the organic globules and animal shapes of the Lifeforms era, however, the images are of harsh cubes and rods overlain with rough photographic textures, much like those found in the ISDN artwork. This imagery is overlaid with footage of Brian and Garry on a Mediterranean holiday, filmed in fisheye style as they explore an abandoned church and cemetery. A bizarre shot of Brian's face superimposed on a pink bubble pushes things slightly too far into daft territory, but shots of textures, including many from the ISDN booklet, bring things back down to earth. The overall feel is just that, brutal realism, a dark, harsh take on the real world without the dreamlike otherworldliness of earlier videos. Snakehips Part 1 is where we get to the Vit Drowning section. The raw footage of him thrashing around underwater is used, but also edited to form the basis for some remarkable shots near the start where only his silhouette is recognisable. Shawneen was also at the shoot and looks considerably more comfortable being underwater than Vit as she swims around. The swimming pool footage is interspersed with various oceanic shots including waves and sea creatures. Snakehips Part 2, although musically distinct from the first part, continues with the water theme. Footage of Spiky from the Lifeforms video joins underwater shots of Garry and Shawneen, lit by flares and surrounded by bubbles. Imagery from the Far Out Son of Lung video is also injected at a frenetic rate in the second half, as well as more organic CG images of strange spiralling entities. It's all quite effective, but the video and computer imagery seem somewhat at odds with each other, leading to jarring changes in tone. Interestingly, the album version of Snakehips with the full outro is used here, rather than the truncated single version. Smoking Japanese Babe brings the visual theme back down to earth again with what looks like Super 8 footage taken of the band's trips in the US. The lo-fi grainy look is striking after the more professionally shot material on the previous video. The home movie sections alternate with footage taken from the TV movie WSH, which the band had soundtracked the previous year. Amoeba returns to the Vit Drowning theme, this time overlaid with new computer imagery showing metallic polygons flying around. The highlights are the shots of Vit and Shawneen underwater together. The incredible non-swimming dog even makes a brief appearance. All in all, while the visuals are an improvement from the Lifeforms video, particularly helped by a larger amount of live video, Far Out Son of Lung overall doesn't impress as much. It's considerably more abstract, with little to no narrative suggestion at all, making some of the images memorable but the overall construction somewhat forgettable. It's also rare as hen's teeth, with no copies ever sold on Discogs. I've only ever seen one on eBay and I didn't have the cash to get that at the time. If anyone has a copy of this, I would love to just see a photo of it. All 5 videos can at least be found on YouTube. ISDN BBC Radio 1 Essential Mix, the 4th of June 1995. Following their first Essential Mix in 1993 and a live transmission to the Essential Mix show in 94, Brian and Garry returned to Pete Tong's show for their third and final edition in June 95. The 1995 transmission is a halfway between the two, broadcast via ISDN like in 1994 but presented as a DJ mix like in 93. The broadcast was given the title Fucked Up Soup. Confusingly, the This Transmission Coming Up intro from late 93 and early 94 shows opens the mix, which feels very much out of place at this point. A minute in, however, and things change a lot. The first track, A Declaration of Intent by 400 Blows, is a very fitting title. This is not an ambient show in any sense of the word, and it starts very much like that. Picking up on the funkier, jazzier, hip-hop leaning elements of ISDN, the band run wild with the theme here. 400 Blows' funky post-punk sound harks back to Brian's early influences. At 5 minutes, the track merges seamlessly with the industrial hip-hop of Doug Wimbish and Fats Comet. The mix is so perfect that it's hard to spot that a new track has even started. This kind of beat matching is pretty unusual in FSOL mixes. A further formative influence of Brian's, a certain ratio, continue the funky industrial vibe. The robotic Future Sound of London voice sample plays a couple of times in the background and then it's straight on to an unknown track. Small Fish with Spines, Cillion plays quietly over the top of the second half. The track list of the whole show has done the rounds over the years, as essential mix track lists were generally published in Mixmag, but as is to be expected, there are a large number of errors, including a lot of missing tracks, several listed that aren't even in the mix, and lots of tracks simply listed by their EP or album name. The track list in the comments below is the most accurate version available. A second track from Small Fish with Spine, aka Riz Maslin and Neotropic, and Brian's romantic partner at the time, is beat matched in. Patrick Paulsinger's City Lights, Birth Pain takes things in a more electronic direction with Riz's track playing in the background. APE's Snake's Pass plays through with synth samples from Snake Hips over the top. A brief snippet of experimental synth music from Beverly DeFree Dalbert stops the beats momentarily, and suddenly we're into psychedelic territory with the Beatles' groundbreaking Tomorrow Never Knows. The main takeaway from this mix so far is how much closer it feels to what Brian and Garry have done with the 21st Century Amorphous Androgynous than F.S.O.L. It's mixed straight into the Chemical Brothers' chemical beats. This is followed by the first of many Far Out Son of Lung remixes in which the band fuck around with older tracks, largely those from the 60s. Again, the psychedelic rock influence comes through, this time with their remix of Riders on the Storm by The Doors. More early 80s industrial and then hip-hop follows. The first FSOL track of the mix, Snake Hips, is beat matched with Mekon. The second Far Out Son of Lung remix is bizarrely of Barbara Streisand, her first appearance in the FSOL world. The track is followed by a water splash that will go on to feature on Dead Cities the following year. Morganistics in the Shadow is an intriguing inclusion, a track the band used in mixes in '93, although played alongside the ethnic sounding Black Starliner track it fits the mix's mood quite well. The first two spoken samples don't appear until nearly 45 minutes into the mix, another thing that makes this show so unusual. There's a brief appearance of the Cocteau Twins, Garry's favourite group, adding a touch of atmospherics to proceedings. More thoroughly unelectronic music follows, including Fleetwood Mac, the world jazz fusion of McLaughlin, Dimiola, Dilithia, and art rock group Talk Talk. The beats have finally subsided by this point, featuring snippets of various tracks collaged together. The Far Out Son of Lung remix of Laurie Anderson's Oh Superman simply involves mixing it with reloads of Event Horizon. We might not know the source of a spoken sample about a man dancing and going to another world, but as the first new bit of dialogue used in the mix, it does deserve a mention. The first half of the mix closes with the then recently released Amoeba, a brief Woob track of the same name, Woob being the project of Paul Franklin, a former student of Brian when he briefly taught at Salford, and then London Underground, a field recording by the band credited to Yage's Noise Collection. After Environments that would later be released on Environments and Environments 2 in the 21st century, and a new vocoder-laden band ident, things get a bit more contemporary in the second half of the mix with tracks from Tortoise and Lincoln E621. A track by Cum, released on Cum Organisation label, is simply titled Laugh and its exact origins remain unknown. An unknown Osamu Sato track follows, and one wonders whether it's an unreleased remix by F.S.O.L as they supplied another mix for the artist in '95. After some more hip-hop comes Don't Suck On My Bag, credited to Baseballs, which Brian confirms to me is a one-time F.S.O.L alias. Overlaid is the more noise-pleased spoken sample by Stephen Jesse Bernstein used regularly on the 3D Headspace Tour transmissions. And then back to the 60s with Jonathan King's Everyone's Gone to the Moon, which slows down to an abrupt stop, just in time for an unreleased environment, collaging bird calls, eastern instrumentation, spoken word and odd noises. The full version of Kai makes its debut here, the day before its official release. Some more ISDN material follows, and then a bizarre easy listening version of the theme from The Good, the Bad and the Ugly. The final Far Out Son of Lung remixes are of tracks from groups as diverse as The Stranglers and Santana. All the time the beat matching keeps the pace going, with breakbeat and acid jazz tracks linking the more unconventional pieces. The brief Santana track goes on to be sampled in the next piece, Carlos, a new FSOL recording. This would go on to feature on Dead Cities transmissions well over a year later, and its inclusion here places it as the earliest known Dead Cities material. It's kind of a halfway house between the two eras. Amazingly, F.S.O.L Dead Can Dance sound samples follows, a track dating to '92 and tonally at odds with the rest of the show. an unusual inclusion. Z-Box track Arsehold, listed in Mixmag bizarrely as transsexual, contrasts amusingly with Singing in the Rain, and then the show fades out with Live in New York. For the longest time I hated this mix, not only disliked it but found it actively horrible to listen to. I suppose when coming to F.S.O.L, I'm listening for atmospherics, strange samples, spoken word, ambient melodies, and that kind of thing is very thin on the ground here. Beat-heavy grooves and post-punk were types of music that I didn't take to for a long time, and so I just found Fucked Up Soup impenetrable. ISDN feels like pure ambience in comparison. It's only in very recent years I've grown to appreciate this show, especially since close listening reveals how immaculately it's pieced together, with tracks of wildly different styles and eras beat-matched perfectly. It's also a very brave show, broadcast in the mid-90s under the guise of a future-leaning band, and yet consisting largely of material from the mid-50s to the mid-80s. That said, the mix of hip-hop, funk, jazz, industrial and acid is still something I only come to very occasionally, and generally not when I'm in an FSOL mood. As with most of the band's mixes, the show was briefly available in the Podroom, but removed due to licensing issues. It's still easily heard on YouTube and Mixcloud. ISDN White Edition. Release date 5th of June 1995. 6 months after the initial limited edition version came out, ISDN was finally given a wider release. With the first version selling out almost immediately, many fans would have missed out entirely, and thus this reissue gave them a chance to purchase the album. To keep the original special, however, the album was restructured and given new artwork. The main musical difference is the removal of 2 or 3 tracks, depending on the format, and the inclusion of 3 new ones. 2 of these, Amoeba and Snake Hips, had already been released a couple of weeks before on the Far Out Sun single, while the other, Kai, remains exclusive to the album. All 3 tracks fit the same dark, percussive mood of the album in general. Other than some slight changes in indexing on the CD version, the albums are otherwise the same. The artwork changes are more drastic. The black embossed card sleeve is replaced with a standard jewel case for the CD, the artwork in white, and a 16-page booklet. The vinyl version doesn't feature an embossed title. Whereas previous releases generally featured full-page artwork, the ISDN booklet is a montage of photographs, computer-generated imagery and text. Brian, Garry and Boogie had clearly been on their travels by this point, as unlike on Lifeforms, there are no photographs sourced from image libraries. Instead, there are a large number of textures: brick, rusting metal, paint, graffitied walls, peeling plaster, and oily puddle. These sit alongside landscape shots, a sunrise above clouds, lightning in the sky, colour-adjusted lakes and hills, a nighttime cityscape. Vit and Shawneen are among the figures captured in the photographs, with Shawneen stood in front of the sea anemone and spike model in true Lifeforms fashion. Half a page of band photos accompanies one of the stories, including a shot of Boogie for the first time. The gatefold inner landscape of the Black Edition is in the centre spread of the booklet. The 2LP features the same landscape inside the fold-out sleeve, with the other photos and texts on the individual record sleeves. The cassette only features the gatefold image inside. The art features 2 stories. The first, taken from the Black Edition, discusses some of the philosophies behind the ISDN concept. The second, a slightly fragmented tale about the broadcast of a couple of transmissions. In it, Garry talks about the dislocation felt when performing without being able to see or hear the audience feedback. The New York show seems to have been a particularly fraught performance, broadcast at 4 AM Dollis Hill time. The band sat up through the early hours, finding ways to amuse themselves and stay awake. An otherwise unidentified friend, Mason Bentley, made a prank phone call. Old Top of the Pops videos are watched. The transmission went well, but tempers frayed, and Yage, in this case Boogie, stormed off, leaving Brian and Garry to keep the music and visuals going themselves. Every one of Cobain's stories is full of things going wrong in one way or another. The one thing the tale does is demystify the concept somewhat. Bored humans sat in a studio space in North London, attempting to reach out, not knowing whether they were succeeding, and bickering. It's staggeringly at odds with the otherworldly artwork on display. The 1970s Virgin logo appears for the final time on an FSOL record. On the disc and label art, the recurring CD layout too would not be used again. As with the Far Out Son of Lung sleeve the previous month, the phrase electronic brain violins is added to the EPV logo. As with all the other releases from this period, no artwork credits are present. Several tracks are still credited as being from broadcasts they did not feature on, and the New York transmission is bizarrely given a different date. It's My Mind That Works, meanwhile, has apparently shifted from New York to VPRO on the CD edition. The Robert Fripp guitar textures are still assigned to no particular track. On the plus side, the vinyl edition is spread over 2 LPs, meaning far better quality. On the downside, it sadly loses Slider's closing environment in the process. My experience with ISDN over the years has been a difficult one. A lot of this comes from my initial impressions and experiences of the album. Firstly, the bizarre artwork and title. Dead Cities was always clearly an album about a cityscape, Lifeforms was always going to be about deserts and tropical landscapes, Accelerator was probably going to be pretty techno-y and sci-fi with its exploding computer graphics. And then I'd look at ISDN and wonder what the hell it was about. Where was the evocative front cover? Why did the photos inside all show totally different things? Why was it named after 4 random letters? This was an album that was hiding its themes, its ideas and atmospheres. Even at the age of 12, I was into the idea of music existing away from its creators. A piece of music, especially from the likes of F.S.O.L, was a world in its own right, a strange place, and thus immune to hedonistic human concepts. So titles like Just a Fucking Idiot, Smoking Japanese Babe, Snake Hips, these all made me a bit uncomfortable. What sort of horrible, sleazy human sounds would these tracks contain? Wasn't sure I wanted anything to do with them. One of the biggest barriers to my liking the album came from the circumstances in which I acquired it. At £15 a go, CD albums were too pricey for a kid my age, and upon finding some money lying around the house one day, I decided to pick it up, go into town and buy that F.S.O.L album I hadn't got. And then, possessed by the paranoia of the inexperienced criminal, I began to worry that my parents would notice it in my collection and wonder where and when I'd got it. Of course they wouldn't, they had no idea what CDs I owned. And so I made up a story about my friend buying it for me. Needless to say, I wasn't convincing. I got grounded, had the CD taken away from me until I could pay the money back with pocket money, and my friend's parents banned him from seeing me again. Not a fun time in my childhood, and one that severely soured my feelings towards the album. The music too didn't help. Lifeforms and Dead Cities doing amazing jobs of portraying realistic, believable landscapes. The far more surreal headfuck of a geography contained within ISDN, coupled with the darkest and least accessible tracks in their catalogue, made it a very, very difficult album to come to terms with. Some of the tracks immediately appealed, the melodic Dirty Shadows, the fun beats of Kai, Egypt's nocturnal atmosphere, while others, like Snake Hips, made no sense to me at all, them feeling so utterly different to what I expected from FSOL. It would take many, many years for me to really accept the album, and not until well into the 2010s, going on for 20 years after my first listen, did I start to truly appreciate it. These days it's still my least favourite of the Virgin albums, and one that requires a far more specific mood than most of their records, but I definitely enjoy it a lot when I'm in the mood for it. The place it occupies is still one dramatically unfamiliar to my own experiences, but sometimes it's fun to disappear down the rabbit hole and try and find my way through such an alien landscape. Despite 10,000 fans already owning a copy of the Black Edition, the second release managed to chart higher, reaching number 44 in the first of its 2-week run in the top 100. Had the original version not been so limited and all copies bought in the same first week, this suggests it may well have charted highly. That said, some fans were unimpressed by the number of tracks reissued between the two albums and the Far Out Son of Lung single, as this piece of charming correspondence sent to the EBV PO Box suggests. Kai. The oldest track on ISDN by some way, the band started work on Kai in late 92 or early 93 during the Tales of Ephedrina sessions, as evidenced by its first appearance on the first Kiss FM transmission of 93. The track is built on a basis of a humming, growling synth note, also heard in the intro environment to Lifeform's Path 5. The bulk of the track is built around a slinky drum loop that gives it a very bouncy feel. Unsettling flute samples, bleeping synth sequences and Predator samples all fit in with the atmosphere of Tales, and the middle section, with pummeling acoustic percussion, is the part debuted in early 93. Just when the track gets going, the drums cut out, adding a sense of staggered uncertainty, mirrored by the haunting synth notes that break through in the final third. A track that manages to be creepily dark and bouncily fun at the same time. No transmission date is given in the ISDN liner notes, and its first known appearance is the 1995 Essential Mix, broadcast the day before the album was reissued. Amoeba. Amoeba is built around a staggered vocal sample, giving a somewhat airy feel, although the track's crushing drum beats bring the piece closer to the typical ISDN sound. The opening environment, featuring electric guitar, is absent from the single version, instead appearing one track earlier at the start of Smoking Japanese Babe. Structurally, the piece follows fairly typical ISDN era tracks, building and falling down several times over the course of the piece. There are comparatively few background samples, with most of the focus being on the various layers of percussion. The closing environment on the ISDN version is a bleak, echoing space. Another track with no transmission date given in the ISDN liner notes, and again it was first broadcast on the 1995 Essential Mix the day before the album's release. Snake Hips. The white edition of ISDN returns to the band's modus operandi of ending albums on slightly baffling notes, unlike the black edition's epic and end of sorts. Possibly the funkiest track on the album, Snake Hips builds up from a slow trip-hop drum loop, adding layers of fretless bass, brass, pizzicato strings and electric guitar. Other than the rising and descending synth notes that run throughout in the background, it's one of those pieces that you could imagine being performed capably by a live band. As it breaks from the main verse-like sections, each breakdown seems to be different, adding a huge range of variation within the track as it goes on. There are even some bold, colourful synth splashes at the end of the track, adding a surprisingly emotional finish. The track is built around several samples of 23 skidoo, an early influence of Brian's, including Kundalini and Vegas El Bandito. Snake Hips used to be my least favourite F.S.O.L track, but over the years I've really come to enjoy it as a really fun track built around a great groove. As with the other two tracks, there's no transmission date in the booklet, and the essential mix was the first known broadcast. 1995 remixes and compilation tracks. A slightly busier year for these in 94, with 3 variations on a remix for John Anderson and a remix for Osamu Sato, as well as the only standalone track released as Far Out Son of Lung. In fact, there were technically more remixes and compilation tracks released in 95 than new tracks on FSOL releases. Far Out Son of Lung, Cow. The excellent Excursions in Ambient series of compilations featured FSOL 3 times, including exclusive track Deep Into Your Subconscious I Slide in 94 and Cow for the 4th volume in 95. This final volume in the series moves away from the ambient house approach of the first 3 compilations somewhat, with more of a focus on isolationism, darker, more industrial-tinged ambient music, and indeed there are tracks spanning post-rock, abstract experimentalism and IDM on there, as well as Brian and Garry's final ever Far Out Son of Lung track. Clearly stemming from the ISDN sessions, Cow is in fact an alternate take of Snake Hips Part 1. Retaining the hip-hop groove, Cow turns the previously mellow track into something a lot harsher, replacing the jazzy instrumentation with distorted synth lines and warped samples. Countless layers of percussion feature, giving the track a thick, textural feel. In contrast, there are far fewer of these single-shot weird noises usually associated with the group's sound, making it slightly more straightforward sounding than normal. Still, it's a heavy, chugging track and one that acts as a fitting farewell to the ISDN era. John Anderson, F.S.O.L Deseo Reconstruction. After releasing his Deseo album, a foray into world music released on the new age label Windham Hill, former Yes vocalist John Anderson asked a number of contemporary ambient musicians to use it as raw material to create their own remixes. Ethno ambient groups Deep Forest and Transglobal Underground turned in 2 and 3 remixes each, while more ambient techno-leaning acts Global Communication and FSOL sent in 2 each. FSOL's under the name Deseo Reconstruction. Unsurprisingly, the track is as close to world music as the band ever really treaded, but the funky bass, layers of heavier percussion and horn samples add a rawer feel, with the piece eventually feeling like a halfway house between the sounds of Lifeforms and ISDN. 2 elements tie it directly to the ISDN era, a recurring synth sample from You're Creeping Me Out, and the intro environment of Eyes Pop Skin Explodes Everybody Dead appearing at the end. Whereas the band's previous Virgin era remixes tended to build up a theme into a crescendo, Deseo Reconstruction throws uncountable elements from the album into the mix, one after the other, leading to a track structured like a suite with little in the way of repetition. Opening with animal field recordings and ethnic vocals, a beat quickly kicks in, over which various contrasting sections are slotted. At first, bright synths are employed, then the beats break down for a moment. When they come back in, a darker sounding Eastern reed instrument takes the lead. Next up is a percussion-heavy section with the usual textural samples peppered over the top. Dark drones and high-pitched notes follow before the beat cuts out to introduce a jazzy horn melody and buzzing crickets. Next up, new age synth pads. Then chopped-up vocals appear up front. Finally, the Eyes Pop environment plays out for the final minute. All in all, it's arguably the busiest and most varied track in the band's entire catalogue, and one I'm yet to fully get my head around. Although lacking some of the epic beauty of the group's best remixes, it's a fascinating track that's well worth repeat plays though. The version released on the Speed Deep single appears minus its outer environment. John Anderson, F.S.O.L Deseo Reconstruction No. 2. This second mix is far more stripped back than the first, cycling through fewer sections and largely focused on main synth themes. The percussion is less dense and there are fewer samples appearing throughout the mix, ultimately making it feel a little less FSOL-ish as a result, although it's probably an easier track to get your head around. This version appeared on the Speed Deep CD single and the Deseo Radio Mixes promo album. John Anderson, FSOL Deseo Reconstruction No. 2 Radio Edit. A CD promo only radio edit of the second Deseo Reconstruction, this track is somewhat confusing, neither being allowed time to properly grow into an absorbing soundscape, nor ever approaching radio-friendly single territory. Quite a lot of the track is spent in the downbeat breakdown style sections, not really allowing a groove to form for too long. A curio, but an unsuccessful track in its own right. Osamu Sato, Face Savers Online FSOL mix. F.S.O.L's final remix of the 90s is probably their most atypical. As with the Deseo Reconstruction and the earlier Fripp and Sylvian Darshana remix, the band were given access to the full album, in this case Japanese multimedia artist Osamu Sato's Transmigration. Where that album is largely melodic ambient techno, the remix is full on ISDN era sleaze, slowed down breaks, snarky bassline, skronking saxophone, clanging industrial percussion, wailing distortion. It's as dark and harsh as the band have ever got. And then halfway through its punishing 10-minute runtime, a whooshy environment briefly takes over, and suddenly the track moves into transy acid territory, all burbling 303 bass and fast-paced drum machines. Eerie samples begin to spill into the track, electronic drones and atonal synth scales, electronic squirms and metallic percussive sounds, eventually building up with an energetic breakbeat. It's like a more developed version of one of the group's occasional experimental jumping and pumping tracks, and bears absolutely nothing in common with the first half of the remix other than being twice the same tempo. This remix remained pretty much unknown to fans until the late noughties when it suddenly appeared on the FSOL board. A mid-90s remix was an unexpected turn-up at that point, and its utterly baffling content and structure have made it difficult to comprehend to this day. One of the very weirdest moments in a very weird career. After this, it would be another 6 years until an FSOL remix was released, and another 19 until a non-psychedelic rock-themed one, the track capping a generally strong run of mixes during the Virgin era. The one thing they all have in common, if we count the 12-inch version of Liquid Cool, is the length, all running between around 8 and 10 minutes, which is far longer than almost all original tracks the band released in the 90s. It's a shame that Virgin never decided to go down the remix album route, as a disc containing the Brian Ferry, Curve, Sylvian and Fripp, Shaman, Apollo 440, John Anderson and Osamu Sato remixes together, joined by the band's own environments, would be a pretty special release. Of course, these weren't the only remixes the band were contracted to do in the 90s, and several were turned down or accepted but never completed. Among these are artists as diverse as the EZ Posse, Prince, Gary Newman, Massive Attack, No Doubt and Supergrass. The Gary Newman link was through their early tech guy Tim Jones, who actually arranged a meeting. The band went round to Newman's house and apparently had a very nice time, but could never really work something satisfying with the remix. Another unreleased remix of the Justified Ancients of Moo Moo's It's Grim Up North eventually was played on a Touched Music broadcast in the 2010s. And that's it for today, and indeed the ISDN era, and with the end of this era, a run of releases that went back right to mid-1990. Next time we'll be looking at the origins of the Dead Cities era, with a couple of late 95 broadcasts with the earliest roots of that album, and a couple of early 96 releases. Until then, please do leave me a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this music, on this video, on these transmissions and releases. I really love reading your comments. There are also like, subscribe and share buttons you might like to press. And I hope you'll join me next time.